Good morning, children. On previous turn, we had studied structure of flower, right? And we had also seen that flower is the reproductive organ of the plant. Flower is the reproductive structure. With the help of flower, reproduction takes place in plants. And in reproduction, to carry reproduction, 2 to 3 processes are very important. The first one is pollination and the second is fertilization. These two processes are very important for reproduction. So let's start from pollination. This is pollination. Students, what is pollination? I told you that in the male reproductive part of the flower. And what is the male reproductive part? Male reproductive part is the stamen. Okay, and in the male reproductive part, the pollen grains are produced. Pollen grains are male reproductive cell. Okay, so in the male reproductive part, that is in stamen, the male reproductive cell, that is pollen grains, produced. Okay, so stamen produce pollen grains. And in stamen, which part pollen grains are present? In stamen, anther. Okay, this is the filament, like long, and at the top of the filament the bilobed anther like this is present, and in this bilobed anther the pollen grains are produced like this. Okay, the pollen grains are produced in these anthers. Okay, so and the female reproductive part, students, I told you the female reproductive part is stigma, style, and at the base the solen ovary, right? This is the stigma, this is style, and this is ovary. Okay, it is stigma, it is style, and it is ovary. And inside the ovary there is ovule, and inside the ovule there is the female reproductive cell, that is egg cell. Okay, so male reproductive organ forms the pollen grains, and in the female reproductive part, this female reproductive cell, that is egg cell, present. Okay, so students, firstly the pollination takes place. What is the meaning of pollination? Students, the transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma is called pollination. Okay, this is anther, right? In this pollen grains are present, and this is stigma, style, and ovary. This is the stigma. So the transfer of these pollen grains from this anther to stigma, okay, this process is called pollination. Okay, transfer of pollen grains from this anther to stigma is called pollination. Okay, now let's read it. It is a process. We are here, students. Open page number 36 and read it. It is a process by which pollen grains are transferred from male part to the female part of the flower, right? Okay, the male part of a flower is called stamen, which produces pollens. The female part of the flower is called pistil, which consists of stigma, style, and ovary. For seed formation, means for reproduction or for seed formation, pollen grains produced in the anther must be transferred to the stigma of the pistil. This transfer of the pollen grain from anther to flower to the stigma of the flower, same flower or another flower, is called pollination. And there are two types of pollination is there: self pollination and cross pollination. Students, in your book here definition of pollination is written, but it is little complicated because of this line, but I am telling you in very easy way what is pollination. Pollination is the transfer of these pollen grains from anther to the stigma. Okay, from anther to the stigma of the flower, this is the stigma. Okay, so transfer of pollen from anther to the stigma is called pollination. Now students, this pollination is of two types. Okay, the first one is self pollination and another one is cross pollination. So let's read it. What is self pollination? When the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant, it is called self pollination. Students, suppose this is a plant. Okay, this is a plant and this is a flower it is one flower. This is one flower of the plant and this is another flower of the plant. Okay, this is another flower. So the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower is called self pollination. Okay, means students, on previous turn I have shown you a flower, a hibiscus flower. In that flower I have shown you that stamens were also there and stigma and style and ovary were also there in the same flower. Means in one flower male reproductive part is also there, female reproductive part is also there. That flowers are called bisexual flowers. Okay, you can see here bisexual flowers. So suppose this is a plant and in this flower male reproductive part is present. This is male reproductive part, and wait students, I am drawing again. This is the plant. Okay, and this is the male reproductive, this is a flower in which this is male reproductive part and this is female reproductive part. Okay, so the transfer of pollen grain from this anther to the stigma of the same flower, this is called self pollination. Okay, transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower means anther is also on this flower and stigma is also on this flower, then this type of pollination is called self pollination. And if suppose, now again I am drawing a plant. Now if one flower is here and another flower is here, okay, in this flower anthers are present, in this flower anther are present and stigma in this flower is present. Okay, so if the transfer of pollen grains takes place from one flower to another flower, okay, transfer of pollen grains from one flower to another flower but on the same plant is called self pollination. It is also called self pollination. Okay, so self pollination is of two types, cross pollination and self pollination. What is self pollination? स्टूडेंट्स, अगर एक ही प्लांट के एक ही फ्लावर पे, ओके, एक ही फ्लावर का पॉलन ग्रेन उसी फ्लावर के स्टिग्मा पे ट्रांसफ़र होता है, देन दिस इज सेल्फ पॉलिनेशन. और अगर एक फ्लावर के एंथर का पॉलन ग्रेन दूसरे फ्लावर के स्टिग्मा पे ट्रांसफ़र होता है, बट दोनों फ्लावर अगर सेम प्लांट पे हैं, बट ऑन द सेम प्लांट, ओके, बोथ फ्लावर्स आर ऑन द सेम प्लांट, देन दिस इज ऑल्सो कॉल्ड सेल्फ पॉलिनेशन. ओके, एनी कन्फ्यूजन? I hope student it's clear to you that when the transfer of pollen grain takes place from anther to stigma of the same flower or from anther to stigma of the another flower but on the same plant, then this is called self pollination. Okay, now cross pollination. What is cross pollination? When the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of a flower of one plant here is written anther of a flower of one plant to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same type, this is called cross pollination. Means suppose this is a mango plant, okay, and this is also a mango plant, same type, okay, both plants should be of same type, means both plants should be of mango or both plants should be of grapes, okay, same type plant should be there. Now this is a flower, here is also a flower. Now if the transfer of pollen grain takes place from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on different plants, then this is called cross pollination. Okay, I hope students it's clear to you. Transfer of pollen grain from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on different plant of the same type, then this is called cross pollination. Plants भी different होने चाहिए, flowers also should be different and plants also should be different. Okay, there should be two plants, and if the pollen grain of this plant is being transferred to the stigma of this plant, then this is called cross pollination. Okay, now agents of pollination. Students, let's read it. Agents of pollination. Some plant cannot move from one place to another since plant cannot move from one place to another as they are fixed, right? Plants are fixed at their position, they cannot move from one place to another place. So they need the help of natural factors to transfer their pollen grain from one plant to another plant or to flower of the same plant. Students, how pollination will take place? Plants cannot move from one place to another place, then how these pollen grains will reach to the stigma of the same flower or another plant? How it will take place? For this, for pollination, some natural factors help is necessary. Okay, plants need help of some natural factors. Let's read here. Let's read it. Grains from one plant to another plant or to flower of the same plant. These natural factors, okay, they need the help of some natural factors, and these natural factors are wind, water, insects, birds, and some other animals also. Okay, by the help of wind, the pollen grain will be blown in the wind and will reach to the stigma of the flower, or insect can carry the pollen grains, can be stick in the legs of the insect, and then they can reach from anther to the stigma of the flower. Okay, so these are the wind, water, insect, and birds, and some animals. With the help of these natural factors, pollen grains can reach from the anther to the stigma. Okay, these factors help in transferring pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, right? Okay, so with the help of wind, water, and insect, pollen grains transfer can take place from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower. Okay, therefore they are called agents of pollination. So these wind, water, insect, birds, and some other animals are also, these are called agents of pollination because they help in pollination. Because of them, the pollen grains transfer from anther to stigma can take place. That's why they are called agents of pollination. Okay, now firstly we will see how in pollination, how wind helps in pollination, we will see. Okay, students, the example of the plants in which pollination takes place by the help of wind, those plants are rice, maize, grass. Okay, rice, maize, grass, these are the plants in which pollination takes place with the help of wind. So what features should be there in these plants, in rice, maize, and grass? What features should be in these plants so that the pollination by wind can take place? Let's study the features of these plants. The first is pollen grains are light and dry. Okay, the pollen grains of these plants should be light in weight and they should be dry so that they can easily be blown by wind and reach to the stigma of another flower. Okay, if they will light in weight, then by the help of wind they can blow easily from the anther to the stigma. Okay, the next is pollen grains are produced in large quantity because a small number of pollen grains may not be able to reach the stigma of the flower. Students, in wind pollination, the pollen grains should be produced in very large amount because the pollen grains are blowing by the wind and they are coming from one place to another place. So in the mid of the way, many pollen grains can be wasted also, na? Okay, many pollen grains can be wasted also. So that's why the pollen grains are should be produced in large amount. Okay, so that if despite of wastage, means waste के बाद भी कुछ number of pollen grain reach कर जाएं stigma तक. Okay, so for this large number of pollen grains should be there. Okay, the next is the stamen usually has a long filament. The stamen usually has long filament with anther that hang outside the flower. The filament of the stamen should be long and it should be come out of the flower so that if the pollen grains pollen grains when released from this anther, they can easily move further to reach on the stigma of the flower. Okay, so their filament should be long and the stamen should be hang out of the flower. Okay, the stigma is large and feathery so that the pollen grains lying in the wind can easily be received. Okay, so the filament of the stamen should be long and the stigma should be large and feathery. Okay, stigma should be feathery, hairy. On the stigma, small hairs, feathers should be present so that when pollen grains can come, they can easily be stick to this stigma and the pollination process can be done. Okay, so in this way pollination takes place by wind. The pollen grains should be light in weight and they should be dry so that they can easily blown by wind. Pollen grains should be produced in large amounts so that if some amount of pollen grains are wasted, then even some amount of pollen grain can reach to the stigma. And the next is filament of the stamen should be long and the stigma of the carpel should be hairy or feathery to catch the pollen grains. Okay class, so today we had studied about pollination and pollination by wind also. Now on next turn we will study pollination by water, insects, birds. Okay, thank you class.